We've just got some breaking news in from Buckingham Palace, folks. So this statement has just come in from Buckingham Palace, and I'll read it for you. It goes on to say, His Majesty has today initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles and...
The royal briefing had barely begun when King Charles made a decision no one in the room expected. A routine palace discussion suddenly collapsed into silence after members of Camilla's family were discovered inside a restricted palace area connected to the meeting. Charles stopped the briefing immediately. But the deeper shock came moments later, when Princess Anne demanded answers, and Prince William openly backed her, turning an uncomfortable discovery into a confrontation over access, trust, and the boundaries of royal power. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles raised one hand before the senior aide could continue reading the agenda. The gesture was small, but the room understood it instantly. This was no interruption. It was a shutdown. A royal briefing is a private working meeting where senior members and trusted officials discuss sensitive household business, and attendance is normally cleared in advance. William watched his father close the folder himself. Anne did not look surprised. Camilla did. Charles froze when an aide leaned close and gave him the names. He set the folder, turned toward Camilla, and asked one question. How had members of her family entered a restricted corridor linked to offices being used for the briefing? She answered quickly. She had not arranged it. She had not asked anyone to bring them through. But Anne's attention moved past her to a household official, who suddenly avoided everyone's eyes. Anne's anger stayed controlled, which made it sharper. She asked whether palace rules now changed, depending on whose relatives were involved. William hesitated. Supporting her risked making the moment look like a challenge to Charles. Yet staying silent would mean accepting a breach that could set a dangerous precedent. The prince finally spoke. Anne was right, he said. The access had to be explained before anything continued. A security officer then delivered the detail that changed the mood. Camilla's relatives had not wandered into a public reception room or residential passage. They had crossed into a controlled working corridor, connected to the briefing area. That mattered, because such spaces separate family life from official royal business. And once those boundaries become informal, trust inside the household weakens. Camilla insisted again that she had given no permission. Charles believed the denial deserved to be heard, but Anne noticed the aide hesitate when asked who had cleared the entry. William noticed it too. Charles ordered the doors closed and demanded the access log. The briefing had stopped, but the real danger was only beginning, because the people now facing each other were not strangers to this argument. They were family. Behind the security breach were four people carrying four very different fears. Charles feared humiliation inside his own household. Camilla feared that her family was becoming the symbol of a problem she insisted she had never created. Anne feared standards were being quietly weakened. And William feared something even more dangerous, that every exception tolerated today would become a precedent he would inherit tomorrow. Suddenly, a locked corridor had become a test of loyalty. Camilla waited until the others had moved away before speaking to Charles alone. Her voice dropped as she asked whether he truly believed her relatives had deliberately entered royal business where they did not belong. He did not answer immediately. That silence cut deeper than anger. As monarch and head of the royal household, the king carried responsibility not only for his family, but for the system operating around them. Any private mistake could quickly become a question about whether royal rules still meant anything. Finally, he told her that intention was not the whole issue. Her family had been somewhere they should never have been. William found Anne near the briefing room entrance moments later. She was still tense, but her anger had hardened into something quieter. She asked whether he had backed her because he mistrusted Camilla. The prince answered carefully. He had supported the rule, not the feud. That distinction mattered, because he represented the future reign. and whatever Charles tolerated now could become a precedent he would one day be expected to defend. Anne understood that immediately. She had spent years resisting blurred boundaries, precisely because small exceptions had a habit of becoming permanent privileges. Charles's embarrassment turned into anger when a palace access list reached him. The record showed that one of Camilla's relatives had entered a staff-controlled part of the building weeks earlier. A staff-controlled area is a working section used by household employees and officials, rather than ordinary visitors, meaning access is expected to be cleared rather than assumed. The discovery suggested the latest incident was not isolated. Worse, the earlier entry had apparently been facilitated through a household contact instead of the standard visitor procedure. Camilla felt the ground shifting beneath her. What had begun as one uncomfortable breach was becoming a wider question about how her relatives were treated inside the palace. She insisted again that she had never ordered special access. Charles believed her denial, but he could no longer ignore the pattern. Someone inside the household had decided normal procedure could be softened, and that decision now threatened both his authority and her standing. Anne then turned to William with a warning he had not expected. This had started before the briefing, she told him. Weeks earlier, at one specific palace event, a private boundary had already been crossed, and her objection had been brushed aside. Anne had not forgotten the first warning, and once she reminded William when it happened, the stopped briefing no longer looked like an accident at all. The crisis did not begin outside the briefing room. It began weeks earlier during a private Windsor reception, when one seemingly small favor changed the palace atmosphere. A member of Camilla's family was allowed through a staff-only passage after the official guest route had closed. Anne noticed. She questioned it. The concern was dismissed as harmless. But what happened that night became the precise trigger everyone would later revisit when Charles suddenly stopped the royal briefing. Anne had been watching the movement of guests closely that evening, not because she expected trouble, but because the reception mixed relatives, personal guests, working royals, and senior household staff under one roof. A staff-only passage is an operational route used by palace employees and officials rather than ordinary visitors, so even informal access matters, because it blurs the line between private convenience and controlled royal business. When one of Camilla's relatives was quietly escorted through that passage after asking to avoid the formal guest route, Anne stepped forward and stopped the aide. Anne asked who had authorized it. The aide answered that the Queen had no objection, but his confidence faltered when she immediately asked to see the approval. Nothing was produced. She went straight to Charles and warned him that private convenience was beginning to override household procedure. The king was exhausted after a long evening and told her he would deal with it later. That answer stayed with her. To Anne, delay was no longer neutral. It meant the line had been crossed, and nobody wanted to admit it. Camilla heard about the exchange soon afterward and confronted Anne privately. She accused her of turning a harmless family courtesy into something cold and insulting. Anne refused to soften her position. The queen consort argued that her relatives were not security threats. The princess answered that this was never about treating them like threats. It was about whether palace rules still applied when family discomfort entered the equation. Neither woman persuaded the other, and Charles chose not to reopen the dispute that night. William later discovered the detail that changed everything. No formal authorization from Camilla could be found for the Windsor access, suggesting somebody had invoked her name without direct instruction. Worse, the same household contact linked to that earlier shortcut appeared again on the internal trail connected to the briefing Charles had just stopped. The prince finally understood Anne's warning. She had never been focused only on Camilla's relatives. She had been watching a culture of unofficial permission take shape around them. Charles felt the weight of that realization when the Windsor record was placed before him again. Anne had seen the weakness first. He had postponed it. Now the same names had returned, the same shortcut had reappeared, and Anne was no longer prepared to accept another quiet explanation. The argument everyone had avoided finally happened, with no ceremonial smiles left to hide behind. Anne faced Camilla directly and demanded to know how her relatives had crossed another palace boundary after the Windsor warning. Camilla refused to accept responsibility for decisions she said she had never authorized. Charles tried to keep the exchange controlled. Then William spoke. His words were measured, but their meaning was unmistakable. Anne's concern was legitimate, and family connection could not become a substitute for formal permission. Charles brought the four of them into a private follow-up meeting after the suspended briefing, with only one senior secretary present to record the decisions. He made one point clear before anyone could turn the discussion into an accusation. This was not a claim of criminal conduct. It was an inquiry into why household access procedures had been bypassed, because those procedures exist to keep private family life separate from official royal work. The king knew that if those boundaries became optional, every future security decision would become harder to defend. Anne did not soften her words. She told Camilla that the problem was no longer simply who had entered the corridor. The real problem was how many people inside the household had begun to assume that ordinary rules could be bent when the visitors belonged to her family. The queen consort's anger rose immediately. She accused Anne of making her relatives pay for years of suspicion and resentment. Anne answered without hesitation. She would demand the same standard if the people involved were her own children. Charles then asked the question everyone had been circling. Had Camilla ever told staff that her relatives should be treated with family discretion? She admitted she had used the phrase before, but only socially, never as a security instruction. The answer seemed harmless, until William spoke again. The prince explained that staff appeared to have interpreted those exact words as permission to avoid normal clearances. A casual phrase from a senior royal, he warned, could carry more weight inside the palace than the person who said it ever intended. Camilla's fury began to collapse into fear. She had not consciously ordered a shortcut, yet her words may have helped create one. Anne pushed her chair back and stood. "Then help us end it," she said. William remained seated for several long seconds before quietly adding that this was the only way forward. Charles finally saw the deeper threat. The danger might not have been deliberate interference by Camilla's relatives at all. It might have been a shadow system built by staff trying to anticipate what powerful people wanted without ever asking them directly. The confrontation had exposed the emotion. Charles's next task was harder, discovering who had actually been exercising power in the spaces between those words. No royal household runs on titles alone. It runs on access, assumptions, relationships, and the quiet authority of people who know which doors can be opened without asking twice. When Charles demanded the internal records, the crisis changed shape. The evidence did not point to a dramatic command from Camilla. It revealed something more uncomfortable. Aides had been making judgment calls based on what they believed senior royals wanted, creating privileges nobody had formally approved. Charles ordered the review widened immediately. He did not want Camilla's family singled out, and he refused to let the inquiry look like a personal purge. The king instructed staff to examine guest clearances connected to the close relatives of all senior royals, because senior household officials control private appointments, visitor movement, service corridors, and restricted working areas. Those decisions can look administrative, but they matter, because one quiet shortcut can become an accepted rule before anyone realizes what has happened. William felt the pressure almost at once. He worried that backing Anne would be portrayed inside the family as an attack on his father's wife, rather than a defense of procedure. The prince admitted as much to her privately. Anne did not comfort him. She told him neutrality would have been easier, but easier was exactly how these habits had survived. William understood the warning. If he stayed silent simply to avoid tension, he would inherit the same blurred system later. Charles sat alone with the access summary and felt anger rise into something heavier. 3 entries carried the same pattern. He circled them with a pen, then stopped when he saw the same coordinator's initials beside each one. The monarch had expected to find one bad decision. Instead, he found repetition. Worse, he felt betrayed not by Camilla, but by a culture that had taught staff to protect powerful people from inconvenience, rather than ask difficult questions. The internal record identified a senior household coordinator who had repeatedly approved informal movements under phrases like family access, without obtaining normal written confirmation. A household coordinator is a senior staff member responsible for arranging practical access and movement inside royal residences, which meant these informal approvals could quietly bypass the safeguards everyone assumed were still operating. Charles then read the coordinator's documented internal interview. The admission was devastating. Nobody had explicitly ordered the exceptions. Staff had simply learned that questioning royal relatives created friction, so over time, they stopped questioning them. Camilla's words had not been commands, but deference had turned assumption into authority. Charles now had enough information to act. But the solution would not be painless. William knew it. Anne knew it. And Camilla was about to discover that ending the system meant accepting consequences that would reach people close to her own family. The king had found the mechanism. What remained was the painful part, breaking it, even if the consequences landed inside his own marriage. Charles did not reverse his decision to stop the briefing. He went further. The household privileges that had allowed informal access were suspended. Staff were ordered to use identical visitor procedures for every extended royal relative, and the coordinator at the center of the exceptions was removed from access duties. The decision restored control, but it also left Camilla facing a humiliating reality. Her family had become the reason the palace was rewriting rules designed to prevent exactly this kind of confusion. Charles signed off on a single standard for everyone. Camilla's relatives, Anne's wider family, William's extended connections. None would be allowed to rely on informal introductions or assumed privilege when entering operational palace areas. A pre-cleared visitor process means names must be approved in advance before access is given to working sections of a royal residence. The king knew the rule would only carry weight if it applied without exception, because a standard that changes for powerful families is not really a standard at all. Camilla sat with Charles after the decision and told him her relatives would now feel like intruders inside places they had visited before. Her voice carried more hurt than anger. The monarch did not dismiss that pain, but he refused to soften the policy. He told her the rules could not be written around anyone's embarrassment. She then asked the question that had been building since the confrontation. Had William and Anne forced his hand? Charles answered quietly. They had forced him to confront something he should have addressed sooner. The admission left her silent. William learned something important soon afterward. Anne had never demanded that Camilla's family be barred from the palace. She had asked only that their access be treated no differently from anyone else's. The prince understood the difference immediately. What had looked like a personal challenge was actually a demand for consistency, and that distinction mattered because it separated discipline from punishment. Camilla then received the detail that unsettled her most. Anne had specifically opposed a harsher proposal from one security official who wanted temporary exclusion imposed on certain relatives. The queen consort had spent days believing the princess was trying to push her family out. Now she learned that Anne had actually prevented the toughest option from being adopted. Camilla remained seated after Charles left. She removed her glasses, pressed her fingers against her eyes, and reread the sentence establishing equal access procedures. Humiliation still burned. Defensiveness still remained. But now something more complicated had entered the room with her. doubt about whether she had misunderstood Anne's motive from the beginning. For the first time, Camilla could no longer dismiss Anne's position as hostility, and that realization prepared the ground for the conversation that would change everything. There were no secretaries, no security officers, and no king to soften the words. Camilla asked Anne for a private conversation, and the two women finally faced the real argument beneath the locked corridors and cancelled briefing. It was not simply about access. Camilla believed her family had never been fully accepted. Anne believed protecting the monarchy required refusing special treatment, even when refusing it looked cruel. This time, neither woman walked away. Camilla had requested the meeting after learning that Anne had opposed a proposal to bar her relatives entirely from restricted royal residences. That detail had unsettled her, because it did not fit the story she had been telling herself. A restricted royal residence area means a part of the palace reserved for working, security, or private household use, rather than ordinary guest access. Anne had defended that boundary, but she had also stopped the dispute from becoming punishment. Camilla spoke first. She told Anne that every controversy involving her family seemed to become proof that they had never truly belonged. She admitted that this was why the access dispute had cut so deeply. Anne listened without interrupting. Then she answered that she understood the wound, but understanding it did not mean abandoning the rule. If family pain became a reason to weaken boundaries, she said, the palace would eventually have no boundaries left. Anne then admitted something of her own. Her anger at Windsor had not been aimed only at Camilla. It had grown because Charles had dismissed the warning and promised to deal with it later. The princess had walked away believing comfort was being protected while discipline was being postponed. That, more than any personal grievance, was what hardened her position. Camilla finally gave the assurance Anne had been waiting for. She said she had never knowingly authorized unrestricted access and would not allow staff to use her name as implied permission again. Anne answered with an equally important truth. She had never believed Camilla personally planned the briefing intrusion. Her fear was more dangerous than that. A culture of unchecked deference had grown strong enough that nobody needed to order the shortcut. People had learned to create it themselves. The tension changed. It did not disappear, but it lost its bitterness. Anne saw that Camilla was no longer defending privilege. The queen consort saw that the princess had never been trying to humiliate her family. Camilla reached the door as the conversation ended, then stopped. She turned back and said she would publicly support Charles's equal access rule, even if her own relatives resented her for it. Anne answered with a quiet nod. For the first time, anger gave way to guarded respect. The private conflict had finally broken. But the outside world knew only that Charles stopped a royal briefing. And when that news emerged, the palace faced its next trial in public. By the following news cycle, the palace dispute could no longer be contained behind private doors. The headline was irresistible. Charles had halted a royal briefing after members of Camilla's family were found inside a restricted palace area, while William backed Anne's demand for answers. But what looked like a family rebellion from the outside began to change when the full response emerged. The palace was not dividing into camps. It was closing a loophole. Charles authorized palace communications to confirm that the briefing had been suspended because of an internal access concern, and that revised visitor procedures were now in force. Palace communications is the official system used to explain royal decisions to the public and press, which meant the wording carried unusual weight. The king also insisted that the new standard applied to relatives connected to every senior royal, not just Camilla. That detail mattered, because it transformed the episode from a personal dispute into a rule about institutional discipline. Camilla knew the public story still revolved around her family. She feared that supporting the reform would look like an admission that she had done something wrong. William faced pressure of his own. Several aides urged him to create distance from Anne's intervention, arguing that the appearance of division could damage Charles. The prince refused. In a private recorded conversation with his staff, he said he would not pretend to disagree simply because the optics were uncomfortable. Camilla made her choice soon afterward. She watched the coverage in silence, listened to broadcasters debate whether she was resisting the restrictions, then told an aide to release her prepared statement exactly as written. The Queen Consort publicly supported the equal access policy. That single decision ended the strongest suggestion that she was fighting Charles over the new rules, and gave William something he had feared might never come: a way out that did not force his father to choose between his wife and his heirs. Anne also refused to turn the moment into a victory. In a documented palace discussion, she made clear that her concern had always been procedural discipline, not a campaign against one family. The princess understood that humiliation would only deepen the fracture. Her restraint mattered because the monarchy now needed unity more than triumph. Public reaction exploded outside Buckingham Palace. Cameras settled on a morning newspaper carrying the words "King halts briefing" above photographs of Charles, William, Anne, and Camilla. Visitors stopped to photograph the front page, while a broadcaster explained that the palace had imposed one visitor rule for all extended royal relatives. In one instant, the scandal and the solution stood side by side. The public saw conflict first. The final palace meeting would reveal something different, what each of them had been willing to sacrifice to end it. The royal briefing that Charles stopped never resumed in its original form. It did something more important. It forced the king, his wife, his sister, and his heir to confront a weakness they had allowed to grow through politeness, assumption, and fear of offending family. William's decision to back Anne looked, for one explosive moment, like rebellion. In the end, it became something else entirely: pressure that helped Charles draw a boundary strong enough to protect both his marriage and the institution. Charles reconvened William, Anne, and Camilla only after the new access procedures were already in force. The security review, the formal examination of how people entered and moved through restricted palace areas, was complete, and its conclusion was clear. No evidence showed that Camilla had deliberately ordered unauthorized access. But the household had still failed. From that point forward, every extended royal relative would require documented clearance before entering operational palace spaces, ending the informal idea of family access once and for all. Charles turned first to Anne. He admitted that he should have acted after her warning at Windsor, instead of promising to deal with it later. The princess did not celebrate. She did not demand an apology. She simply told him that the rule mattered more than proving who had been right. That answer brought a quiet relief to the king, because the crisis had finally stopped being about victory and humiliation. Charles then faced William. He told the prince that supporting Anne had not weakened him, because William had challenged a flaw in the system rather than the authority of the crown. The future king answered that he had never wanted his father weakened. He had wanted the monarchy protected from a precedent that could one day become impossible to reverse. Camilla accepted the findings without another argument. She personally instructed her relatives not to request exceptions, and in doing so, removed the final source of tension. Anne later acknowledged that cooperation in a private documented conversation, closing the personal conflict without demanding friendship, surrender, or humiliation from either woman. Charles finally closed the review folder. He looked first at Camilla, then Anne, then William, and said the matter was finished, because the rule was now clear and applied to everyone. That was the real verdict. William had backed Anne, but Charles had turned that challenge into a universal standard, instead of allowing it to become a family war. The doors that caused the crisis were closed under one rule for everyone. And in that decision, The monarchy chose discipline over privilege, unity over resentment, and a clean ending over another hidden wound. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.